So welcome. Thanks for being here. Full disclosure, when I got an email from Michael Beal asking me if I would come and give a talk, until 2 weeks ago, I made the assumption that he was talking about just coming and doing a brown bag with his group. And then before I left for Denver, I hit on the link and I was like, oh, this is a little more involved than I thought. I'm not sure the talk is going to be any different, but we shall see. So I'm Robert Bohannon, and my two primary affiliations for sort of what I'm going to share this morning is I'm an ecologist with the North Temperate Lakes Long-Term Ecological Research Group. And so that's part of a national and even international network of ecological sites that we all we measure the same set of parameters around climate change and biological diversity and nutrients, and then each site does their own specific thing. Our particular site is focused on watersheds, lakes, streams, and rivers, wetlands. There are other sites that in other regions of the country that focus on deserts, some on cities, like there's a Baltimore Ecosystem Studies project, Central Arizona, Phoenix. So there are a variety of sites, and then some of what we built into, a lot of what we built into the games comes out of models, scientific models that were developed around that. And then I'm also with the Wisconsin Institute for Science Education and Community Engagement, and I am still convinced that that was an acronym in search of words. But what I do there is professional development with K-12 teachers, and then summer programs for pre-college students, especially underrepresented high school students. And so just by way of a little background, my role in Econauts and other games development was to really identify some knotty things to teach, some really difficult ecological concepts to teach, and then to sort of help incorporate some of our best ecological models into the game design and development. And so some of the core ideas are interdependent relationships and then ecosystem dynamics. And some of the things that we were looking for were students developing and using models, describing and predicting patterns, constructing explanations, designing solutions, and then evaluating scientific information. And when I was first approached by what was then the Games Learning Studios and then its next iteration, Gear Learning, I was skeptical. I'm not a gamer. I mean, my wife finds it hilarious. My wife spends hours every day playing like Elder Scroll and all these things, and she wants me to look at her, her newest avatar, and she talks about this guild, and we can't have dinner now because, she and her guild are going on a quest, and I'm like, I don't care. But what I found was that the more I started learning about the opportunities, I recognized that here's a real chance to teach some things that I just haven't been able to teach effectively. And here are a couple, these are actual slides that I've used in lectures. This is the way I typically teach ecology. And, we ask students to try to look at patterns, make inferences, and it's all terribly, terribly exciting to me. And even if students do begin to pick up patterns, like over here with covariation, and this is a classic that has shown up in textbooks since at least the 1960s on predator-prey cycles. And it creates a persistent misconception. The conclusion here follows that lynx control hair. There's no empirical data to suggest that that's true. In fact, if you look at a food web, there are about 30 different predators that feed on snowshoe hare and ignores competition. But again, this for me was the best I had. And and looking at time series with trends. And if you think about just the misconceptions of climate change, this is how we often present information, and it's not been real effective so far. And so the more I began to see the development and the design of games, and it was so cool to be in on the ground level of this, I absolutely loved sitting down with the artist especially and talking about, okay, how can we represent heavy metals? How can we represent toxins from mining? That was just a blast. And so what I'm going to share with you is how we situated. Econauts is kind of the cornerstone, but we also situated it in sort of a suite of games and with the idea that we wanted to have something so that if a teacher only had a class period to develop or to devote to something like this, we could do that. But if they also wanted to do a unit played out over several weeks with lots of different experiences, they could do that as well. And so Citizen Science is a computer game, and in that it emphasizes evidence and arguments. This particular piece I found very effective. It's called Lake Globe, but students can manipulate then variables and look at the response. And in this particular example, it was interesting that when they do littering, has absolutely no effect on any of these ecosystem responses. And students were surprised by that. But it's a way for them to begin to identify important variables in the system. And then Econauts, which I hope in the arcade you'll take some time to play. And then this is a board game that a teacher, Milwaukee high school teacher, developed in I taught a course about 3 years ago, and even though I started out as a skeptic, we built the entire course, an entire ecology course on games and games development. And the teachers were required to, either as an individual or in a group, then to develop a playable game by the end of 3 weeks. And people were very, very frustrated with me at first. And then it was the most beautiful thing that you saw. And teachers developed things that they could take back into their classrooms. And this is a game that Gear Learning, Michael and some other folks then also worked with and really helped develop it. And Michael Lawton has been using this in his classroom in Milwaukee. He's introduced other teachers to it, and then he uses it in a course in the summer that we do. Okay, so we're going to play. As there's also one, at the heart of this is trying to help students develop their reasoning about what is a scientific model. And if you look at the standards and if you look at cross-cutting standards, that's kind of the gold standard, is can they think critically and carefully about scientific models. So if you can come up and help me. And so I've used this in a large lecture, I've used it in small groups, but this is a way to introduce this formidable idea of what is a scientific model. And so we're going to build a little simple model, play it, and then think about revising it. And so the model has very simple rules, and it's got one goal. And so the rules are that there are going to be 2 feeding stations, here and here, and there will be about 10 foragers in equal lines, so about 10 of you arrange yourself over here and 10 over here, or well here, so we don't mess this up. So if we could get 10 people to line up here and 10 people along the edge. And so the rules, so what's happening in the model to guide gameplay is that you may not budge, so there's no budging. You can't push anybody out of line. That's especially for you, Richard. I've known Richard long enough to be careful to say that. And when you get to a feeding station, if food is present, so imagine you're a bee foraging on flowers. If there's nectar there, you can get nectar. If there's not, you have to go to the back of a line. So after your first round, you can switch lines if you choose. You don't have to. And then your goal is to maximize the number of food items. So this is a maximization model. You want to maximize the number of food items that you get. Okay? Okay, so.
Is it individually maximized or line maximized?
Individually. Good question. Yeah, even though we're social animals, we're going to pretend that we're not. Okay, so let's begin. Sorry. Sorry.
You said there's no skipping?
No skipping. Sorry. Sorry.
It's like church.
Sorry. Sorry. No. 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 Sorry. Sorry. I hope you notice that I am a polite feeding station. Yep. No, sorry. No. Nope. No. Okay, let's stop there, because you're out of food, right? Okay. So you can go back to your seats. Thank you. And then we can pass the Hershey's around, because, well, I feel like I should. Okay, so what did you notice? Yeah.
Mentally, I was paying attention to how she was giving out the
Yep.
candy, and I noticed that she wasn't really skipping anyone.
Yep.
So I went back to that line.
Yep.
Because I figured that was a shoo-in to get another one.
So you began to notice the difference between that, like, again, if you thought about in nature, 2 patches of flowers, potentially. What else did you notice?
Different varieties of treats.
So, yeah, so there were different treats. Now, we were looking at maximizing. So, did anybody get more than 5? High school students usually get more than 5. Did anybody get 4? Okay, so, and did you get all the same kind?
No.
Okay, so what did you get?
2 of each.
2 of each. What about 3? How many of you got 3? You can count the ones that you just ate too, because I'm also paying attention. Yeah, so 3. And how many of you got 1? Okay. How many of you didn't get any? Are you being honest? Okay. So everybody got at least one. So now, one of the things that I like to use this for is to then talk about, okay, how realistic is that model? And how might we revise it? You know, if we wanted to make it more ecologically reasonable, what are some things that you might do? We didn't have any competition. Okay, you couldn't budge. There was no risk of predation. What else?
We conform to kind of filling back in the lines, how, just as well, I need to go to the back of the room and get
Right.
back in line as opposed to maybe walking across the row and skipping in front of someone because
Yep.
that's what we do.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So if you were going to change this, let's imagine that you're doing this, what might you change? Yeah.
Instead of staying in the front of the room, or there's a row, I'd stand in the middle.
Okay.
And just have, because it's coming from all directions.
Yep.
Be able to get more than one piece of candy.
Okay. So you could change the number of food items you got. Other ideas? It was mentioned there were different types of food. So if we introduced efficiency, so if we introduced optimality, where you're expending the least amount of energy for the most energy gained, and so that's an optimal foraging model, then you might weigh the nutrition, the caloric content. And so the Hershey's, I think, are about twice what the Werthers are. Yeah.
But the Werther's flavor lasts longer.
And so one of the things that you could build in is preference. And so that would be another thing to build in. Yeah.
Blindfold the person handing out so you can see who it is who's coming up to them.
Okay. Because I might not be honest about it. Yeah. Other ideas? Yeah.
Not have a person handing out food, maybe just have two spaces where the food just sits and people come up and grab it.
Have the stations. The stations could be pretty far apart, so you could increase searching time. One of the things that we include in the scientific models is this notion of handling time. And so once you capture the food, how long does it take before you're able to start foraging again? And so if you had to completely eat a Werther's versus completely eat a Hershey's, I could eat a Hershey's faster because I was taught never to crack my teeth on hard candy. I don't know if that's a rule that your grandparents imposed, but mine did. And I'm a rule follower. So there are lots of ways, and how we do this in classrooms and in groups with students is we have them in small teams revise the model, and typically revise it to make it more ecologically or evolutionarily realistic. One of the coolest examples I saw was a group that they wanted to include natural variation, and so they had height as a variable, and so some of the food was out of reach of some of the students in the class, and you couldn't climb up on chairs. And I just thought that is so elegant. I mean, that they recognized that here's this natural variation in a population and built that in. So this gives us an opportunity to introduce just scientific models, and here's just some information about how we've done it and some of the things that we can begin to pull out. But what we've tried to do with the ecological games is have students begin to think about cost and benefits. And clearly, publicly, we're not really good at thinking about cost and benefits, especially long-term benefits. And so this is a way to introduce some of that. And we've done this in a variety of contexts in the Madison area, Verona Public Schools, Milwaukee, Lakeland area schools, which is in northern Wisconsin, much more rural population, boys and girls clubs, after school science clubs, and I've used it in teacher professional development as well. So here are the different contexts that we've introduced these. Now I think for time, No, I'm going to do it. Because I promised myself I wouldn't rush today. So I'm not going to rush. So I would like you to take like about 2 minutes, and on that little half sheet of paper that went around, draw a lake. Just draw a lake. Just take a minute or two. Just draw a lake. Okay, so now hold your lake up so that people around you can see. Okay, so what do you notice? Anybody notice anything?
Huge diversity.
Well, there's a huge diversity. It looks like, I saw one that was not bird's eye view. I think here. Many were bird's eye view, which is what we see typically. And many just use the shoreline, which isn't surprising. I mean, that's how I would initially draw a lake. And so we use this as an artifact. We use this as a pre, and then at the end, we take a look to see how, after playing games, after doing field trips, because we augment the gameplay with field trips, then we look for what changed and how they changed and talk to students about why they changed. But this is very, very typical. So thank you. And so, again, the initial drawings usually looks a lot like that one. That looks a lot like yours, though many of you had more squiggly shorelines, which I appreciate. And then it's pretty rare to get the one in the middle, which I think I saw yours back here, I believe was like that. Okay. It's pretty rare to have something like this. And one of the things that I've noticed is when people do draw this view, this perspective, they tend to also include some plants around the shoreline. And they rarely include plants around the shoreline from the bird's eye view. And then it is exceedingly rare, I think like 2 out of about 400 plus students ever include any kind of vertical profile to the lake. So, so these provide a nice baseline, and then we can see what landscape features students begin to add, because as they begin to add, then you're not just thinking about what's going on in the lake, because what's happening in Econauts, what's happening in citizen science, what's happening in Dwindle is the interaction between land, people, and water. And then here are some actual student representations. So to draw a lake, and these are all post. So this is after some instruction. And so you can see that students started adding some biological diversity, and both the terrestrial and aquatic environment. And I absolutely love this. I love this because it is rare for food webs or any depiction to include the sun as an energy source. And so I found this very striking. And then this, again, we've got a vertical profile and including some biological diversity. This is an N of 1. This one absolutely stunned me when I saw it. And I saw the student developing it, and I was just so giddy. And I saw her adding all these things to it. You know, and I see it, and as a good facilitator, I want to go over and start making suggestions to her. So, but I hold back. And then also how we've used it in the context of Econauts is having the students create an Econauts map. So to create a map that they draw based on their gameplay, and Econauts is set up as squares, and so and they included some legend, and then what a colleague, Mark Stenerson, who used to be here, then would do is, and this was I think a 3-day experience that students had. Students would draw an Econauts map, and then Mark would create them and then load them on the server. And so during gameplay, that student's map would come up. And you would hear this just enormous shout. It's like, oh, that's my map. Because the map server in the game typically has 3 different lakes, a Madison Lake, a northern Wisconsin lake, and the shoreline of Lake Michigan. But this was really instructive, and when we talked with students, some of them wanted to make it more ecologically realistic. Some of the students wanted to make it more difficult to play, and some of the students wanted to make it easier to play. And so there was both sort of a nod to ecology, but then also a nod to gameplay. And then at the end, and this is something that we use at the end of a unit, or it can be used if you just play this one time. In your class, we do a role play, and it gestures at what's going on in several parts of the world, especially think California with drought. And so we create a town hall meeting, and students then select different roles, and these are roles that sort of elaborate on the roles in Econauts. Econauts in its current configuration has 3 roles: a farmer who produces food or vegetables that will then go into a food processing plant, and then a logger which produces lumber for buildings, and then an ore mining company which produces steel for vehicles. And so over time, these are some of the additional roles that students have suggested that there be, and so we added them into a role play at the end. And the students are confronted with a proposition that there is, just because of drought conditions, we are going to have, so it's legislated that there will be a 50% reduction in water use across the board. And then they sit down and they comment on that with the hope of changing that proposition, but they take on the role, and we've done it both ways, where the students can select the role they want to play and where they randomly draw the role that they play. Yeah.
What age students are we talking about?
So we have done this with primarily middle and high school students. I think the youngest students have been grade 5, and then I've used it with undergraduates as well, but it's primarily, the results of this are primarily from middle and high school. And so what I'm looking for as I listen in on this town hall meeting is, what evidence are they using? What arguments are they making about fairness or unfairness? Are they incorporating cost and benefits? And they do not like, so every time we've done this, they want to revise this because this is not fair. This idea that just across the board, because they identify that there are some users that are using way more than their share just because of what they do. And if you love your nice, lush green lawn, you would not want to live there, because they see no value in property owners irrigating in a drought or watering in a drought. But this is another way that we can add another social dimension to the gameplay as well, and also use it as an embedded assessment to see what their arguments are now compared to where they were coming from initially. And then one study I did, we were really interested in this idea of how they're thinking about what a scientific model is develops. And so we used a device that comes from literacy, a Freire model. I got this from one of my favorite elementary school teachers. And so what we do is pre and post instruction. We have students define the scientific model, give examples, give characteristics, and then last year, just as a nod to the political climate, I included fake science, just because it felt good. A number of students identified Bill Nye as fake science, so I'm just saying, don't tell them, but it's out there. And then we also had a series of examples of things like a blueprint, a Lego model, an equation for acceleration. We had a number of things, some of which were pretty clearly a scientific model, and others that weren't, that they had to sort. And so out of all that, pre and post, I had two groups that were using the games curriculum, and these are high school students. And then I had 4 groups that were ecology oriented, that they used the foraging game. So everybody was introduced to that game that you just played. And the ecological concepts were similar, but this used Econauts, Dwindle, citizen science. This used then other traditional ecology things. And so when I went through, and I did all the coding, so there's no inter-rater thing to deal with. When I went through and did the coding, and when I did it, I didn't know which groups were which. Then what we found was a significant difference in how students thought about a scientific model after they had played games, and considerable games, compared to those that had a good solid ecology curriculum. And teacher quality was really comparable too, because I know these teachers very, very well. And so I was pleasantly surprised, and I was especially surprised to see this difference develop just over the course of 3 weeks. So this is a 3-week unit that they were doing. And so this is very encouraging, I think. And so for my skeptical friends that are concerned about sort of games in their science curriculum, I think this is a pretty compelling piece of data. And so some of the things that we've learned are in terms of conceptual understanding, the idea of time lags. So in Econauts, you begin to do an activity, and then a few minutes later, then you begin to see the water turn green. Or maybe you begin to see a fish kill. And so what's beautiful and elegant about that I can't capture with things like those initial graphs, is causal mechanisms. And so my actions, I'm logging here, or I'm producing food here, or I'm producing cars here. My actions, my decisions in the game. So time lags, it helps pull that out. And we've sometimes used to prompt to ask students, okay, can you anticipate a fish kill before you see a fish kill? Because most of them don't want to kill fish. We've had a few students that their mission in the game is to kill fish. But most of the students are averse to killing fish. Describing relationships among multiple drivers. So there's a lot going on. You've got some erosion. One of the things we would love to include, and we've been talking about some ideas of future iterations, is things like extreme weather events. I'd love to see that. Because again, that's something it's difficult to get at. And so the messiness of students trying to control their environment, and all at once you have a hurricane. Like, boom. But we can at least, as we talk about it and unpack things, we can talk about multiple drivers. It does a really, really good job of explaining connections between land cover, land use, and the ecosystem response. Can help students predict trophic cascades, and I think the biggest nugget from it is helping students see cost and benefits of different strategies, because they will change their strategy sometimes even in the middle of gameplay. So we've seen that. And that's alluded to over here. I have routinely seen students when I'm wandering around the room as they're playing, it's like, oh, the fish are dying. What can I do? And they will move away, they'll move their activity away from the lake, even though they get that, oh, a benefit of being close to the lake is I can make money more quickly. And when I saw that, when I saw students doing that just on their own without prompting, I was like, oh, there is hope. There's hope in the universe. And about half of the post gameplay maps, they try to get at ecological realism. And then, as I alluded to, the others want to change the difficulty of gameplay. And then one of the things that there's social dynamics that I didn't anticipate seeing. So even though when they're playing Econauts or playing Dwindle or playing citizen science, they're competing with each other, they tend to cooperate. It might be you, because Richard can't figure out how to drag and drop. He just hasn't had that experience. You would see Richard struggling and you would show him how to drag and drop. Or a student beside you might be complaining, I'm not making money, and you've already made $3,000. You would say, oh, you need to buy some recipes to start making food. And so even though they're competing, we saw lots and lots of cooperation. And then a number of people, and here I'm focusing mostly on the people that were involved in some of the implementation, not the development of Econauts. There was a whole suite of people involved in the development of Econauts, and it was just a blast to work with them. I'm hoping to get the opportunity again. But Jennifer Dawson, Laura Wortman-Blocher, Mark Stenerson, and then Mike Lawton. Mike Lawton is, unfortunately, I think, a really exceptional teacher. But one of the things he recognized in the games course that I was teaching is Econauts, it has one feature it has several features that aren't ecologically realistic, but it has unlimited resources. And so he designed Dwindle to include finite resources. He designed Dwindle so that everybody could lose. And for him to have that insight and then build that into a board game, I thought was like way, way cool. So thank you all. So questions, comments, observations? I wanted to save enough time to hear ideas and get ideas.
I love how this is applicable to what you do, but it's applicable to other content theories and other learning experiences also.
Yeah.
A lot of
Yeah. One of the things that I presented this at our long-term ecological research group conference. We have a big conference that brings all the sites together. And so we did a workshop where people actually played Econauts, they played Dwindle, they played citizen science, they played the foraging game. And there were several people that I think if we can get the resources, then we could have maps that are desert biome, Arctic biome, because we've got sites in both the tundra and the Antarctic. And so there was a lot of interest. What was really surprising to me is pretty much everybody wanted my write-up on the foraging game and how to do that. I think that was kind of the low-hanging fruit. And that was just my attempt a few years ago when I was teaching large lecture in introductory bio to do something kinesthetic. Because I had never done any kinesthetic learning, and I really wanted to do it. And tried this, and I've been doing it ever since. There are some teachers that the adaptation of this is they use non-food because of fear of allergies and other things. I'm glad that I typically don't have to worry about that because I love the idea of a foraging game involving eating. Yeah.
I do like the idea of this very much, especially, I live in Racine, so we've got Foxconn coming in. It's not very often that a $10 billion plant is built in the United States, let alone on farmland that's pretty much been untouched.
Mm-hmm.
The fresh water source. So I see this as being beneficial in that even if you frame it around that context of designing this game, it becomes then what are all, like there's factors and facets as you design this game, not just with small groups of students, but as a whole class, facets and concepts that just may be missed even by common people or experts even as they think through
Yeah.
this whole thing. Because like I said, this is something that hasn't been built in the United States in 50 years.
Right.
Something like this.
Yeah. Yeah, and and I know initially when I was talking with Kurt Squire and Constance Steinkuhler, one of the things that we were really seeking to find some way to pull out some real thinking about cost and benefits, and also the idea of the tragedy of the commons. I mean, lakes and watersheds are shared spaces, but the users, very often, it's not treated as a shared space. And I think things like that town hall meeting around drought, and you could create it around anything. You could create it around designating a lake for a no wake or eliminate fishing from it. And you could take any local issue and make it relevant, but to have students think about things as a common resource rather than mine.
Did you see any teachers expand upon these in their real out of the classroom activities? Do anything different with their field trips or with their exploration?
Yeah, and one of my concerns early on was that I was hoping that we weren't going to create an easy way to teach ecology that didn't involve getting out of doors. And I think for some teachers, maybe that is the case, but my sense, and it's anecdotal from some of I work really closely with a few schools, and so I get an idea of the teacher culture. And one of the schools in Verona, Glacier Edge Elementary, we saw that several grade levels started doing field trips to a little pond near their school. And we saw then other schools coming there. So I think, curriculum like this and pieces like this have definitely encouraged people to go out. Again, that's one of the reasons I'd love to work with some of the other sites because, I've been an aquatic ecologist or a limnologist for over 30 years. For me, it's like lakes and streams and rivers. It's like, why bother with anything else? But I recognize that, not everybody has a body of water that's close to their school. And so I'd love to see, prairies, little grassland communities, woodland, school forest. I'd love to see us make some inroads into that. One of the things that we did do was we were very intentional about creating Econauts where it could be a standalone, but also hoping that people would see its value in fitting into a larger curriculum. And that curriculum that Laura and I wrote is available online, and so people can grab. I think where I've seen teachers making adaptation. I've seen teachers making adaptations in sort of the gameplay in their classroom and doing things like how they stage individual play versus group play, things like that. One of the things I saw in a couple of classrooms that I went into, so I took iPads and went into a classroom, is 2 different teachers in 2 different schools warned me about certain students that I was going to have trouble with behaviorally. Guess which students just thrived playing Econauts? Yeah, so I think for students that are sometimes too chatty or maybe too social or too whatever, I had no problems at all. And so I think there's really enormous value in that as well. Other questions? Comments?
So a quick question about Dwindle. It's really fun.
Yeah.
And I played some local high school kids, and they want to play it again, and they told their friends about it, and they want to play it too. Is it going to be brought to market, or is it going to go through schools? How can I get the game to these kids again?
Yeah, I don't know. I know the teacher, Michael Lawton, he's had some conversations with some folks at Gear Learning, and I think he would like to get it to market. The other thing is, you may notice that some of the game pieces bear a lot of similarity to another board game you might have played. Okay. But what he has done is he's created electronic files so that a teacher can create their own, and I think a couple of teachers have done that. And then the game pieces are pretty available at toy stores and hobby stores. So he did design it so that you could create your own. There's been some reluctance, I think, with some teachers because it takes about an hour, and that doesn't fit nicely into a classroom period, but certainly played over several classroom periods. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the reluctance, if you can find a way to tie that into standards. Do you think that reluctance is more from, would be pushback from the school than necessarily the game itself? Because, if it's teaching what it claims to teach, then does it really matter the avenue that you're going to get there?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I have a personal experience that speaks to that. So after I did this study, and I was just giddy with the results we were getting out of the 2 groups that used the games versus the others that used more traditional ecology curriculum, I was so excited. And then in one program, there was some pushback because we had called the workshop for students, we had called it something like using games to explore ecology. And so the pushback was that it wasn't science. Even though I had what were pretty compelling learning games around what I see as the ultimate part of the standards, is thinking about models and reasoning about models. I think that if you look at cross-cutting standards, that's where it really goes to, and this was doing it. And so I just changed the title of the course.
So it was like a social experiment almost.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Because, again, and to be honest, I had a very similar reluctance. I had some skepticism. I didn't necessarily see the utility and efficacy of using games. And then, 2 years later, I'm teaching an entire graduate course on games and games development. But I was seeing the utility, and I was seeing the efficacy, and I was seeing that this can help learners engage with ecology in a way that you just can't. Even a field trip, which I love, you go out and you take, say, water clarity measurements. Well, you've taken water clarity measurements that day. Maybe you've got another data set to look at, but you know, that's it. Here, you can look at changes in water clarity because of human activity. And I think that's a big key for it. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of the conference.